Hi everyone, okay, here's another great game from Bobby Fischer. You may know this one already, and I apologize if you do, but it's such a great game I felt I couldn't leave it out. It was played at the US Championships in 1963 when Bobby was 20 years old, and was such an amazing win that it won the Brilliancy Prize for the tournament. Bobby had the black pieces against Robert Byrne, a top-level GM and regular on the Olympiad team for America. He had the white pieces and opened with d4, after which came knight f6, c4, g6, g3, c6, bishop g2, and d5, which is going into the neo-Grunfeld defense, notably the 5 c takes d variation after c takes d. And an alternative here is queen b3, which keeps more tension in the game, but Byrne decided on c takes d, so then comes c takes d. And now some normal development with knight c3, bishop g7, e3, black castled, knight g e2, knight c6, white castled, b6 and b3. And at this stage the game is essentially symmetrical, and it's difficult for either side to introduce imbalances. Another possibility, instead of b3 at this stage, is knight f4. And then e6, b3, bishop a6, rook e1, rook c8, bishop a3, rook e8, and rook c1, which had been played by Salo Floor against Stalberg at a tournament in Cameri in 1937. And unsurprisingly, given the completely symmetrical position, the game is completely equal here as well. So b3 is what Byrne played anyway. Then came bishop a6 and bishop a3, and the symmetry continues. And after 11 moves, the game is still very equal. Neither side has noticeable weaknesses or targets, but remarkably, Byrne will resign after a further 11 moves. And when this game was analysed by the South African Chess Quarterly, one of the writers, K.F. Kirby, said, and I quote, "Quite honestly, I do not see the man who can stop Bobby at this time," and it was absolutely true. So rook e8, which is just breaking the pin on the e pawn from the bishop here at a3, queen d2 and e5. And of this move, Bobby wrote in his notes that he was slightly worried about weakening his d pawn here, because after the exchanges that follow, it will be isolated. But his reasoning was that the massive activity obtained for his minor pieces wouldn't give Byrne any time to exploit it, and as usual he was right. So d takes e5, knight takes e5, and rook f d1, which seems like a logical move because it breaks the pin on the knight at e2 here from the bishop and brings more pressure to bear down on the isolated pawn. But more importantly, it weakens the pawn here at f2, and that's a target that Bobby immediately went for. Better here instead was rook a d1, but a lot of analysis was done on this game, and Bobby came to the conclusion afterwards that black can still keep the advantage. Best play continues here, queen d7, bishop b2, rook a d8, queen c2. And black's more actively placed pieces more than compensate for the weakness of his isolated pawn. So anyway, rook f d1 is what was played in the game. Then came knight d3, and immediately we're seeing the piece activity that Bobby was talking about before. And this is a move that threatens knight e4 on the next move, which would give white a lot of problems. Like if he ignores this threat and plays something like h3, then after knight e4, knight takes e4 is basically forced. So then comes d takes e4, and black gets an incredibly strong outpost square, which is going to take white a long time to neutralize, and in doing so he cannot avoid giving black a dangerous passed pawn. Say for example, if the knight reroutes and takes here, pawn recaptures, then black will have a passed pawn on d3. And what's more, black gains this outpost square with the initiative because of the threat bishop takes a1. So it's just really, really bad and uncomfortable for black. So he had to do something about that threat. And the way that he dealt with it was by playing queen c2, which wasn't the best defense. Fritz recommends instead here the passive knight c1, and black would still retain the advantage, but not as strongly as in the game. And again, it's fairly easy to understand Byrne's thinking when he played queen c2, because it discovers a second attacker on the knight, and it's attacked by the rook and the queen, and only defended by the bishop. And there's no further way for black to defend it, so logically it should have to retreat, which would give white some initiative. But here came a great move from Bobby, which was, as usual, the best in the position. Knight takes f2, and this is the whole point of black's previous play, and aimed to exploit the weak f-pawn and open up the position of the white king. Notably, it ensures that the long diagonal will stay open, the h1, a8 diagonal, and that becomes important later, as you'll see. Bobby wrote of this move, "The complete justification for this sack does not become apparent until white resigns." So, king takes f2, which is the only reasonable move. To decline a sacrifice with something like knight takes d5 will lose. There are several ways for black to gain a big advantage. The obvious move, knight takes d1, is strong, but stronger is rook c8, where best play continues. Knight dc3, bishop d3, queen d2, knight 6 g4, rook ac1, knight takes c3, etc., with a crushing attack and a winning advantage for black. So king takes f2, then knight g4, check, and king g1, which is the only move that doesn't lose a lot of material or the game. And knight takes e3, which is threatening the queen. So queen takes d2, and that's really the best hope for white. Like other queen moves, lose at least a piece. And Robert Byrne said after the game that at this stage he was bemused as to why Bobby had chosen this line, because it was obviously lost for black. Maybe he thought knight takes d1 or rook c8 was coming next, but what he had not considered was what Bobby played, the unexpected and game-winning knight takes g2, which is a combination of great depth and vision, so deep in fact that the two grandmasters commentating on the game for spectators in a separate room believed Byrne had a winning game right up until he resigned. Interestingly, with the game at the present position, not even Fritz sees the winning line for black, and presumably Bobby had seen it 4 moves earlier when he sacrificed his knight on f2. So king takes g2, and d4, which is a pawn sacrifice to open up this long diagonal for the light squared bishop here on a6, which will now be a very dangerous attacking weapon. Knight takes d4, and bishop b7 check, and white is completely hopeless. In Bobby's own words, the king is at black's mercy. King f1, queen d7, and here, seeing that he had no hope, Byrne resigned. The line that Bobby had hoped for was queen f2, then would come queen h3 check, king g1, and a powerful rook sacrifice with rook e1 check, rook takes e1, bishop takes d4, and it's all over for white. Best play continues, knight e4, it's the only way to stop the mate threats, and bishop takes f2 check, king takes f2, queen takes h2 check, king e3, rook e8, king d3, bishop takes c4 check, rook takes c4, queen takes g3 check, king c2, queen g2 check, king c3, queen takes c4, and it's all over. So that's it. Another great game from the chess genius Bobby Fischer. I hope you enjoyed that. Please leave any comments or thoughts. Thanks very much.